The morning of October 15th, 1962, started like any other day in the quiet town of Cedar Falls. The autumn leaves were turning golden, and there was a crisp chill in the air that made people want to stay inside with a warm cup of coffee. But for the Whitmore family, this wasn't going to be an ordinary day at all. Robert Whitmore was already up before sunrise, something his wife Eleanor had noticed him doing more often lately. She found him in the kitchen, drinking coffee and staring out the window at their perfectly manicured lawn. At 38 years old, Robert was the kind of man everyone in town respected. He wore press suits to work every day, never missed church on Sunday, and always had a kind word for his neighbors. As the manager of Cedar Falls First National Bank, he was trusted with the life savings of half the town. Eleanor joined him at the kitchen table, wrapping her robe tighter around herself. At 34, she was still the beautiful woman Robert had married 15 years ago, though lately she'd noticed worry lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. She poured herself coffee and watched as Robert drummed his fingers on the table, a habit he'd picked up recently. Their 3 children were still asleep upstairs. Michael, their 12-year-old, was in that awkward stage where he was too old for toys but too young to really understand the adult world around him. He'd been excited about the camping trip for weeks, constantly asking his father about fishing and hiking trails. 10-year-old Katie was their quiet one, always reading books and collecting pressed flowers in an old photo album. And little Danny, just 6 years old, was the family's ray of sunshine, constantly chattering about everything and nothing. Eleanor had been planning this camping trip for months. Robert had seemed stressed lately, working long hours at the bank, and coming home with a distant look in his eyes. She thought a family getaway would be exactly what they all needed. They'd been talking about visiting Pine Ridge State Park since summer, and with the fall weather being so perfect, it seemed like the right time. By 8 in the morning, the house was buzzing with activity. Danny was running around in circles, too excited to sit still for breakfast. Katie was carefully packing her nature journal and colored pencils, while Michael was trying to act cool about the whole thing, though Eleanor could see he was just as excited as his younger siblings. Robert seemed different that morning. Usually he was the organized one, making lists and double-checking everything twice. But today, he kept forgetting things and seemed jumpy every time the phone rang. When Eleanor asked if he was feeling all right, he just smiled and said he was looking forward to some time away from work. The family spent the morning packing their green station wagon with camping gear. Robert had bought a new tent just for this trip, and the children were fascinated by all the equipment. Eleanor packed enough food for several days, including Danny's favorite peanut butter sandwiches and Katie's beloved chocolate chip cookies. She even remembered to bring Michael's comic books for the rainy weather that was forecasted. Mrs. Henderson from next door came over around 10 o'clock with a plate of fresh muffins for their trip. She was the neighborhood's unofficial welcome committee and knew everything about everyone. Eleanor thanked her and mentioned they'd be back by Sunday evening, probably around dinner time. Mrs. Henderson waved goodbye and told them to have fun, watching as they loaded the last of their supplies. What Mrs. Henderson didn't know was that Robert had been making some very different preparations. Over the past few weeks, he'd been quietly closing out small accounts and converting assets to cash. He told Eleanor it was for some investments, and she'd trusted him completely. After all, he was the bank manager. Who would know more about money than her husband? Robert had also been making phone calls late at night, conversations Eleanor couldn't quite hear from upstairs. When she asked about them, he said they were work-related, dealing with some complicated loan situations. Eleanor believed him because she had no reason not to. Their marriage had always been built on trust, and Robert had never given her any reason to doubt him. As they finished packing, Robert took one last look around their house. It was a beautiful 2-story home with white picket fence, exactly the kind of place they dreamed of when they first got married. Eleanor had planted rosebush along the front walkway, and Robert had built a treehouse for the children in the big oak tree out back. It was the American dream, picture-perfect in every way. The children piled into the back seat of the station wagon, arguing good-naturedly about who got to sit by which window. Eleanor double-checked that she had everything on her list, from first aid supplies to extra blankets. Robert loaded the last of their gear and closed the tailgate with a firm click-dot as they backed out of the driveway. Eleanor waved to Mrs. Henderson, who was watering her flower garden. Danny pressed his face against the rear window, watching their house get smaller and smaller. Katie was already reading one of her books, and Michael was studying the road map, trying to figure out which route they were taking to the state park. But Robert wasn't heading toward Pine Ridge State Park at all. Instead, he took the highway exit that led out of town toward the interstate. When Eleanor asked about the route, he said he wanted to take a scenic drive first, maybe stop at some roadside attractions to make the trip more fun for the kids. It seemed like a sweet gesture, so Eleanor settled back in her seat and enjoyed the changing scenery. They drove for hours, much longer than the trip to Pine Ridge should have taken. The children started getting restless, and Eleanor began to feel a bit concerned. But Robert seemed confident about where he was going, so she tried to stay calm. He stopped for gas and snacks, and while the family was inside the convenience store, he made another quick phone call from the payphone outside. As afternoon turned to evening, they finally stopped at a remote rest area. Robert said they were going to camp there for the night instead of driving in the dark. The area was quiet and isolated, with just a few picnic tables and a small parking lot surrounded by dense woods. Eleanor thought it seemed a bit too secluded, but Robert assured her it would be a great adventure for the children. They set up their tent as the sun began to set, and Eleanor cooked dinner over a small camp stove. The children were tired from the long drive, but still excited about their first night camping. They roasted marshmallows and told stories around a small campfire, and for a few hours, everything felt perfect and normal that night as the family slept in their tent under the stars. Mrs. Henderson, back in Cedar Falls, was probably settling in for the evening, expecting to see the Whitmore station wagon in the driveway by Sunday night. The bank where Robert worked was quiet and locked up tight, with no one suspecting that Monday morning would bring a discovery that would change everything. But in that remote rest area, surrounded by nothing but darkness and trees, the Whitmore family was about to disappear from their old life forever. None of them knew it yet, not even Eleanor, but this camping trip was never meant to be a weekend getaway. It was the beginning of something much bigger and more complicated than anyone could have imagined. Monday morning arrived in Cedar Falls like any other day, but something was terribly wrong at the First National Bank. Robert Whitmore's secretary, Betty, kept glancing at the clock on the wall. It was almost 9:30, and Robert was never late. Not even by 5 minutes. He was the kind of man who arrived at work 15 minutes early every single day, coffee in hand and ready to tackle whatever the day might bring. Betty called the Whitmore house 3 times, letting the phone ring and ring until she finally gave up. Maybe they'd gotten stuck in traffic on their way back from camping, she thought. Or maybe their car had broken down somewhere. But as the morning stretched on and important meetings had to be postponed, she knew something was seriously wrong. By noon, Betty was genuinely worried. She called Robert's assistant manager, Tom Bradley, who had worked with Robert for over 8 years. Tom was a steady, reliable man in his 50s who knew Robert better than almost anyone at the bank. When Betty explained the situation, Tom's face went pale. Robert had never missed work without calling, not even when he'd had the flu. 2 winters ago, Don decided to drive out to the Whitmore house himself. As he pulled into their driveway, he noticed that their station wagon wasn't there, which should have been a relief. Maybe they really were just running late from their camping trip. But when he knocked on the front door and peered through the windows, the house felt empty in a way that made his stomach turn. The mail was piling up in their mailbox, and yesterday's newspaper was still lying on the front porch. Mrs. Henderson saw Tom walking around the house and came over to talk. She was a sweet older woman who knew everyone's business, but not in a nosy way. She genuinely cared about her neighbors. When Tom explained that Robert hadn't shown up for work, Mrs. Henderson's face crumpled with worry. She told Tom about how the family had left on Friday morning for their camping trip, how excited the children had been, and how Eleanor had promised they'd be back by Sunday evening. Mrs. Henderson had been watching for their car all day Sunday, but they never came home. She'd assumed they'd decided to stay an extra day, maybe enjoy the beautiful fall weather a little longer. Tom went back to the bank and called the police. Within an hour, Officer Ray Collins arrived at the Whitmore house. Ray was a local cop who'd grown up in Cedar Falls and knew the family well. He'd seen Robert at church every Sunday and had watched Michael play Little League baseball. The idea that something bad had happened to them seemed impossible. Officer Collins started by checking with the state park where the family was supposed to be camping. The park rangers searched their records but found no registration for the Whitmore family. They hadn't checked in, hadn't paid for a campsite, and none of the staff remembered seeing them. It was as if they'd never intended to go to Pine Ridge State Park at all. The police put out a bulletin for their green station wagon, and by Tuesday afternoon, they got the call they'd been dreading. A trucker had spotted the car at a rest stop, about 200 miles from Cedar Falls. It was just sitting there in the parking lot, looking perfectly normal except for one terrifying detail. Nobody was around it. Detective Frank Morrison was assigned to the case. Frank was in his early 40s, a quiet man with sharp eyes who'd been solving mysteries in the county for almost 20 years. When he arrived at the rest stop, he felt that familiar chill that came with serious cases. The car was unlocked, which was strange enough, but what really bothered him was how neat everything looked. Eleanor's purse was sitting on the front passenger seat, and when Frank looked inside, he found her wallet with $63 in cash, her driver's license, and family photos. Her lipstick was there, along with her house keys and a small notepad where she'd written a grocery list. It was exactly the kind of thing a woman would never leave behind if she had a choice. The car keys were still in the ignition. Frank turned them, and the engine started immediately. There was half a tank of gas, and everything seemed to be working perfectly. In the back seat, he found Michael's comic books scattered around, Katie's flower-pressing kit, and one of Danny's toy cars wedged between the seat cushions. These were the kinds of treasures that children never willingly left behind, but the camping gear was gone. The tent, sleeping bags, cooking equipment, and food supplies that Eleanor had so carefully packed were nowhere to be found. It looked like someone had deliberately removed only the camping supplies while leaving everything else untouched. Frank had never seen anything like it in all his years of police work. The rest stop was isolated, surrounded by thick woods and rarely used except by long-distance truckers. The attendant in the small gas station remembered seeing the car but couldn't recall when it had arrived. He worked alone and only paid attention to vehicles that actually stopped for gas. The Whitmore car had just been sitting there when he'd arrived for his shift on Monday morning. Frank organized search teams to comb through the surrounding forest. Volunteers came from all over the county, including many of Robert's co-workers from the bank and families from their church. They searched for 3 days straight, calling out the families' names and looking for any sign of where they might have gone. On the third day, they found something that made everyone's blood run cold. Katie's blue jacket, the one with the flower, buttons that Eleanor had bought her for the new school year, was caught on a tree branch about a mile into the woods. The jacket was torn, as if someone had been running through the forest in a hurry. But despite searching the entire area around where they found the jacket, they discovered nothing else. The FBI was called in when local police realized this case was bigger than anything they'd handled before. Agent Patricia Reeves arrived from the state capitol, bringing with her years of experience in missing persons cases. She was a sharp, professional woman who approached every case with the same methodical precision. Agent Reeves started by investigating Robert's background at the bank. She spent hours going through his files, talking to his coworkers, and reviewing every transaction he'd handled in the past year. Everyone she spoke to said the same thing. Robert was honest, reliable, and trustworthy. He'd never taken so much as a paperclip that didn't belong to him, but as Agent Reeves dug deeper, she started noticing small inconsistencies. There were a few late nights at the office that Robert hadn't mentioned to Eleanor, some phone calls to numbers that couldn't be traced, and a few transactions that seemed perfectly normal but had unusual timing. Nothing that proved anything, but enough to make an experienced investigator take notice. The investigation expanded to include interviews with everyone who knew the family. Teachers from the children's school, members of their church, neighbors, and extended family members were all questioned. The picture that emerged was of a perfectly normal American family with no enemies, no debts, and no reasons to disappear. As weeks turned into months, the case began to consume Detective Morrison's life. He kept the evidence boxes in his office and reviewed them every single day, looking for clues he might have missed. The torn jacket haunted him especially. What had happened in those woods that made a little girl run so hard that her jacket got caught and torn? The FBI brought in experts from around the country. They analyzed the car for fingerprints, tested the torn jacket for any traces of evidence, and even brought in tracking dogs to search the forest again. But every lead ended in disappointment. Every theory fell apart under investigation, and the mystery only deepened with each passing day. The months turned into years, and slowly but surely, life in Cedar Falls began to move forward without the Whitmore family. But forgetting them wasn't as easy as people thought it would be. Their empty house on Maple Street became a constant reminder of the mystery that nobody could solve. Every time someone drove past it, they couldn't help but wonder what had really happened on that October weekend in 1962. Detective Frank Morrison retired from the police force in 1978, 16 years after the disappearance, but he never really let go of the case. In his basement, he kept 3 cardboard boxes filled with every piece of evidence, every interview transcript, and every photograph from the investigation. His wife, Helen, used to joke that he loved those boxes more than he loved her, but she knew it wasn't really funny. The case had become Frank's obsession, the one mystery he couldn't solve in an otherwise successful career. Frank would spend his retirement evenings in that basement, spreading the files across an old card cable and going through them one more time. He'd study the photographs of the abandoned car, read through witness statements until he could recite them from memory, and stare at the picture of Katie's torn blue jacket until his eyes hurt. Sometimes Helen would bring him coffee and find him holding the family photo that had been in Eleanor's purse, just looking at their smiling faces and wondering where they'd gone. The Whitmore house itself became the source of endless neighborhood stories. After sitting empty for 3 years, it was finally sold to a young couple named the Parkers. They got it for a good price because, let's face it, nobody really wanted to live in the house where a family had mysteriously vanished. The Parkers thought they were getting a great deal on a beautiful home, and for the first few months, everything seemed perfectly normal. But then strange things started happening. Mrs. Parker would swear she heard children laughing in the backyard. Especially on quiet Sunday afternoons, Mr. Parker noticed that the treehouse Robert had built for his children would creak and sway even when there wasn't any wind. Their own children, 2 young boys, refused to play in certain parts of the house and always complained that someone was watching them from the upstairs windows. The Parker family lasted 8 months before they moved out. The next family, the Hendersons, made it 2 years before they couldn't take it anymore. Mrs. Henderson claimed she could smell Eleanor's perfume in the master bedroom and sometimes found the kitchen cabinet doors open in the morning, even though she was certain she'd closed them the night before. Their teenage daughter insisted that she could hear typing coming from Robert's old home office late at night, the sound of someone working on important papers that would never be finished. Word spread through town that the Whitmore house was haunted, though people were usually too polite to say it directly. Instead, they'd mention that the house had bad energy or that it didn't feel right. Real estate agents struggled to sell it, and even when they found buyers, the families never seemed to stay very long. By the mid-1970s, the house had been sold 6 times, and everyone in Cedar Falls knew to avoid driving down Maple Street after dark. Eleanor's sister, Margaret, refused to give up hope that her family was still alive somewhere. She lived 3 states away in Ohio, but she made the drive to Cedar Falls at least twice a year to check on the investigation and to visit the places where her sister's family had spent their last known days. Margaret was 5 years older then. Eleanor had always been the protective big sister, so the disappearance hit her harder than anyone else in the extended family. Margaret hired 3 different private investigators over the years, spending her life savings on men who promised they could find answers that the police couldn't. The first investigator, a former FBI agent named Douglas Mitchell, worked the case for 8 months before admitting he was stumped. He'd followed up on every lead, interviewed everyone connected to the family, and even traveled to other states chasing false sightings. Nothing led anywhere. The second private investigator was convinced that Robert had been involved with organized crime and that the whole family had been eliminated because of some deal gone wrong. He spent a year trying to connect Robert to various criminal organizations, but every lead turned into a dead end. Robert's life had been remarkably clean, almost boring in its normalcy. He paid his taxes, went to church, and had never even gotten a speeding ticket. The third investigator had a different theory entirely. He believed the family had been the victims of a random crime, possibly killed by drifters passing through the area who had disposed of the bodies in a way that made them impossible to find. This theory made Margaret feel sick to her stomach, but she needed to know the truth, no matter how horrible it might be. By the early 1980s, the Whitmore disappearance had become the kind of local legend that people told at dinner parties and around campfires. The story had grown and changed over the years, with different versions depending on who was telling it. Some people claimed that Robert had been secretly working for the government and that the family had been relocated for their own safety. Others insisted that Eleanor had discovered something terrible about her husband and that he'd killed the whole family to keep his secret safe. The case was featured on several early television shows about unsolved mysteries. Each time the story aired, the Cedar Falls Police Department would get dozens of phone calls from people claiming to have seen the family. Someone in California was sure they'd spotted Eleanor working at a grocery store. A trucker in Texas swore he'd given a ride to a man who looked exactly like Robert. A schoolteacher in Florida was convinced that one of her students was actually Michael Whitmore, now grown up with a different name. Detective Morrison, even in retirement, would follow up on every credible tip. He'd drive hundreds of miles to interview witnesses and check out sightings, always hoping that this time would be different. But every lead turned out to be a case of mistaken identity or someone looking for their 15 minutes of fame. The real Whitmore family remained as elusive as ever. The bank where Robert had worked eventually hired a new manager and tried to move on, but customers would still ask about the missing family. Robert's old office was converted into a conference room because no one felt comfortable working in the space where a man had planned what might have been his family's final days. Tom Bradley, who had discovered Robert's absence that first Monday morning, never quite got over the guilt of feeling like he should have seen the signs of whatever was coming. Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor who had been the last person to speak to Eleanor, moved away from Cedar Falls in 1975. She told people she was ready for a change of scenery, but everyone knew the real reason. She couldn't stop thinking about that final conversation, about how Eleanor had smiled and waved and promised to be back by Sunday evening. Mrs. Henderson kept wondering if there had been something in Eleanor's eyes, some hint of fear or worry, that she'd missed. The children who had been Michael, Katie, and Danny's classmates grew up and had families of their own, but they never forgot their missing friends. Every so often, usually around the anniversary of the disappearance, someone would bring up the Whitmore case at school reunions or town meetings. The story had become part of Cedar Falls history, a mystery that defined the town as much as any landmark or local tradition. As the 1980s drew to a close, most people had accepted that the truth about the Whitmore family would never be known. Detective Morrison was in his 70s and still going through those boxes in his basement, but even he was starting to lose hope. Margaret had stopped hiring private investigators and was trying to make peace with never knowing what had happened to her sister. But sometimes the truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it. And for the Whitmore family, that moment was about to come in a way that nobody could have predicted. The year 1992 was supposed to be just another ordinary year in Cedar Falls. Detective Morrison was 73 years old now, spending most of his days tending to his garden and reading mystery novels. though he still kept those 3 boxes. In his basement, Margaret had turned 65 and was finally trying to accept that she might never know what happened to her sister. The Whitmore house had been sold again, this time to a family brave enough to ignore the local rumors and ghost stories, but 3,000 miles away. In a small hospital room in Calgary, Canada, something was about to happen that would change everything. A man named William Hendricks was dying, and he had a secret that had been eating at him for 30 long years. Bill Hendricks was 71 years old and had lived what most people would consider a successful life. He'd owned a small construction company, raised 3 children, and had been married to the same woman for 47 years. To everyone who knew him, he was just a regular guy who worked hard, paid his taxes, and minded his own business. But Bill had been carrying a burden that was heavier than any construction beam he'd ever lifted. The cancer had started in his lungs and spread quickly through his body. The doctors gave him maybe 2 weeks, and Bill knew his time was running out. His family gathered around his bedside, expecting him to share final words of love and wisdom. Instead, Bill surprised everyone by asking to speak with Father Mackenzie. The hospital chaplain, Father Mackenzie, was a kind man in his 50s who had been providing comfort to dying patients for over 20 years. He'd heard all kinds of deathbed confessions, from small lies to major regrets. But when he sat down next to Bill Hendricks that cold February evening, he had no idea he was about to hear something that would solve one of the most mysterious disappearances in American history. Bill started talking in a weak, raspy voice, his words coming slowly as he struggled with each breath. He told Father Mackenzie about his younger days back in the 1950s and early 1960s, when he'd worked in finance before starting his construction business. He'd known people, he said, people who could help someone disappear if they needed to start over with a new identity. Father Mackenzie listened patiently, thinking this was just an old man's rambling memories. But then Bill mentioned a name that made the priest sit up straight: Robert Whitmore. Bill said he'd known Robert back when they both worked in banking, before Robert moved to Cedar Falls and before Bill moved to Canada. They'd stayed in touch over the years, just Christmas cards and occasional letters. In the spring of 1962, Bill explained, Robert had contacted him with an unusual request. Robert was in trouble, serious financial trouble that could send him to prison. He'd been skimming money from the bank where he worked, taking small amounts over several years that had added up to a fortune. An audit was coming, and Robert knew he was going to be caught. Bill's voice grew even weaker as he continued his story. Robert had begged for help, not just for himself, but for his wife and children, who had no idea what their father and husband had been doing. Robert couldn't bear the thought of his family facing the shame and disgrace of his crimes. He wanted to disappear, to take his family somewhere safe where they could start over with new names and a new life. At first, Bill had refused. What Robert was asking for was dangerous and illegal. But Robert was desperate, and he offered Bill a large sum of money to help arrange the disappearance. Bill had debts of his own at the time, and the money would solve all his problems. After weeks of Robert's pleading, Bill finally agreed to help. Father Mackenzie was amazed by what he was hearing. This sounded like something out of a movie, not real life. But Bill continued his confession with details that were too specific and too consistent to be made up. He described how he'd contacted certain people he'd known from his banking days, people who specialized in creating false documents and helping wealthy clients disappear when they needed to avoid legal troubles. The plan they came up with was elaborate but simple. Robert would take his family on a camping trip, but instead of going to the state park, they would drive to a remote location where Bill's contacts would be waiting. The family would abandon their car and camping gear, making it look like they'd been victims of some terrible crime. Meanwhile, they would be driven across the border into Canada with new identification papers and enough money to start fresh. Bill explained that Robert had been converting his stolen money into cash and gold for months before the disappearance. He'd also been slowly preparing his family for the idea of a big adventure, though Eleanor and the children had no idea what was really being planned. The camping trip was just the cover story that would give them time to get away before anyone. realized they were missing. The hardest part for Bill to confess was what happened to Katie's jacket. During the transfer from their car to the escape vehicle, little Katie had been scared and confused. She'd tried to run back to their familiar station wagon, and in the darkness and confusion, her jacket had gotten caught on tree branches. Robert had to make a terrible choice. Either they could spend time searching for the jacket and risk being discovered, or they could leave it behind and let people think something bad had happened to Katie. Robert chose to leave the jacket. It broke his heart, Bill said, but he believed it would help sell the story that his family had been victims rather than willing participants in a disappearance. The torn jacket would make people think they'd been attacked or kidnapped, not that. They'd simply walked away from their old lives. Father Mackenzie was struggling to process everything he was hearing. This wasn't just a confession about helping someone evade justice. This was the solution to a mystery that had haunted an entire community for 30 years. He asked Bill why he was telling him this now, after keeping the secret for so long. Bill's eyes filled with tears as he explained that the guilt had been destroying him slowly for 3 decades. He'd watched the news coverage of the disappearance, seen the pain on Margaret's face during television interviews, and read about Detective Morrison's obsession with solving the case. Bill had tried to convince himself that he'd helped save a family from disgrace and prison, but he knew he'd also caused incredible pain for everyone who loved them. The money Robert had paid him had helped Bill start his construction company and build a good life for his own family. But every success felt tainted by the knowledge of what he'd done. Every time he hugged his own children, he thought about the relatives who would never know what happened to Robert. Eleanor, Michael, Katie, and Danny. Bill made Father Mackenzie promise to contact the authorities after he died. He didn't want his own family to suffer for his crimes, but he couldn't take the secret to his grave. He owed the truth to Margaret, to Detective Morrison, and to everyone who had spent 30 years wondering what had happened to the Whitmore family. 3 days later, Bill Hendricks passed away peacefully in his sleep. Father Mackenzie waited until after the funeral, out of respect for Bill's family, and then made the phone call that would change everything. He contacted the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and told them he had information about an old missing persons case from the United States. The RCMP contacted the FBI, who contacted Detective Morrison's old department in Cedar Falls. When the current police chief called Morrison to tell him about the confession, the old detective could barely believe what he was hearing. After 30 years of wondering, he was finally going to learn the truth about the case that had consumed his life. The phone call that Detective Morrison received on that March morning in 1992 was the moment he'd been waiting for his entire life. His hands were shaking as he hung up the phone and immediately called Margaret in Ohio. When he told her that they finally had a lead, a real lead after 30 years, she broke down crying and couldn't speak for several minutes. The investigation that followed, Bill Hendricks' confession, moved faster than anyone expected. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police were incredibly helpful, and within days they'd traced several leads that pointed to a small farming community called Riverside, about an hour outside of Winnipeg, Manitoba. The town had a population of just under 3,000 people, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or so they thought. Agent Patricia Reeves, now in her 60s but still sharp as ever, flew to Canada to oversee the investigation personally. She'd never forgotten the Whitmore case, and like Detective Morrison, it had haunted her for decades. The local RCMP officer assigned to help her was Sergeant David Chung, a thoughtful man who'd grown up in small communities and understood how newcomers could blend in if they were careful. They started by checking records from 1962 and 1963, looking for any family that had moved to the area around the time of the disappearance. What they found was interesting. A family named Williams had purchased a small farm outside Riverside in late 1962. The timing was perfect, but the details were what really caught their attention, according to the records. James Williams was 38 years old when he bought the farm, exactly the same age Robert Whitmore had been when he disappeared. His wife, and Williams, was listed as 34, matching Eleanor's age. They had 3 children, Mark, who was 12, Lisa, who was 10, and young Timothy, who was 6. The ages were identical to the Whitmore children, but the Williams family had a story that explained their arrival in Canada. James told people that they'd fled an abusive situation in the United States, that Anne's first husband had been violent and they'd had to escape for their safety. It was the kind of story that made people sympathetic rather than suspicious, and the small community had welcomed them with open arms. Agent Reeves and Sergeant Chun drove out to the farm on a cold, overcast day in late March. The property was well maintained, with fields that stretched as far as the eye could see and a modest two-story farmhouse that looked like it had been loved and cared for over the years. There was a red pickup truck in the driveway and smoke coming from the chimney when they knocked on the door. It was answered by a woman in her 60s with graying hair and kind eyes. She was wearing an apron covered in flour, and the smell of fresh bread filled the air behind her. Agent Reeves looked at the woman's face and felt her heart skip a beat. Even after 30 years, even with the changes that time brings, she could see Eleanor Whitmore in this woman's features. The woman introduced herself as Anne Williams and invited them in for coffee, assuming they were there on some routine police business. She called for her husband, who came in from the barn wearing work clothes and a confused expression. When he saw the serious faces of the law enforcement officers, James Williams went very pale. Agent Reeves spoke gently but directly. She told them she was investigating a missing persons case from 1962, and that they had reason to believe the Williams family might have information that could help. She watched as James and Anne exchanged glances, and she could see 30 years of carefully constructed lies beginning to crumble. James, who had been Robert Whitmore for the first 38 years of his life, sat down heavily at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. The weight of 3 decades of deception was finally too much to bear. Anne reached over and took his hand, and Agent Reeves could see that whatever else had happened, these two people genuinely loved each other. The confession came slowly, painfully, with long pauses and tears from both James and Anne. Robert explained how the embezzlement had started small, just a few $100s here and there to help with household expenses when money was tight. But it had grown over the years until he was stealing thousands of dollars, always telling himself he'd pay it back when his investments paid off. When he realized an audit would expose everything, Robert had panicked. He couldn't bear the thought of his children visiting him in prison, of Eleanor having to work multiple jobs to support the family while he served his sentence. The shame would have destroyed them all, he believed, so he'd convinced himself that disappearing was the only solution. Eleanor, who was really Anne now, had been completely shocked when Robert finally told her the truth on that camping trip in 1962. She'd been terrified and angry, but she'd also been faced with an impossible choice. She could turn in her husband and watch her family fall apart, or she could trust him and try to build a new life. Together in a foreign country, the children had been the hardest part. Michael, Katie, and Danny had been too young to understand why they couldn't go home, why they had to use different names, and why they could never contact their friends or relatives again. Robert and Eleanor had told them that bad people were looking for their family and that they had to stay hidden to stay safe. Over the years, the children had accepted their new lives because they had no choice. Mark, who had been Michael, was now 42 years old and ran a successful auto repair shop in town. He was married with 2 children of his own and had no memory of being anyone other than Mark Williams. Lisa, formerly Katie, was a school teacher who lived in Winnipeg with her husband and teenage daughter. Timothy, who had been little Danny, worked as a veterinarian and had just gotten engaged to a local nurse. None of the adult children had ever known the truth about their past. As far as they were concerned, they really were the Williams family who had fled an abusive situation in the United States. Robert and Eleanor had decided early on that the less their children knew, the safer they would all be. The reunion with Margaret was arranged 2 weeks later, and it was one of the most emotional moments Agent Reeves had ever witnessed in her career. Margaret flew to Canada immediately, and when she saw her sister for the first time in 30 years, both women collapsed into each other's arms and cried for what seemed like hours, but the reunion was complicated by 30 years of pain and anger. Margaret was overjoyed to learn that Eleanor was alive and well, but she was also furious about the decades of grief and worry she'd endured. She'd spent her life savings searching for her sister, had never married because she was too focused on the mystery, and had suffered through countless sleepless nights wondering if Eleanor was dead or alive. Eleanor understood her sister's anger, but she also tried to explain the impossible position she'd been in. She'd wanted to contact Margaret so many times over the years, but Robert had convinced her that any contact with their old life would put the entire family at risk. They'd built a good life in Canada, he argued, and reaching out to the past could destroy everything they'd worked for. The legal complications were enormous. Robert was still wanted for embezzlement in the United States, though the statute of limitations had expired on some of the charges. The Canadian government had to decide whether to extradite someone who had been a model citizen for 30 years. The adult children had to grapple with learning that their entire childhood had been built on a lie. Detective Morrison finally got to close the case that had defined his career, but the satisfaction wasn't as sweet as he'd expected. Yes, he'd solved the mystery, but the solution was more complicated and painful than anyone had imagined. The Whitmore family hadn't been victims of a terrible crime. They'd been ordinary people who made extraordinary choices when faced with impossible circumstances. The story made international news when it broke, and people around the world were fascinated by the family that had successfully disappeared for 30 years. But for the people involved, the truth was both a relief and a tragedy. After 3 decades of wondering, they finally had answers. But those answers came with the knowledge that an entire family's life had been built on deception, and that the truth, while finally revealed, had the power to hurt as much as it healed.